Hello and welcome to another edition of The Nation This Week. You're joining me, Eleanor Abdullah. And as usual, every Friday, our selected panel and I will be discussing trending stories for the week. On today's episode, I'm joined by Datuk Dr. A.T. KUMARARAJAH, Treasurer General of NCCIM, Bobby Varanasi, Tech and Business Analyst, as well as Peter NICOLL, Managing Partner of Counter Risk Consultancy Malaysia, Sdn Bhd. Welcome to The Nation This Week, gentlemen. Let me begin with some of the stories that are stand out this week. And of course, the first story is monkeypox cases. So let me give sort of like a little bit of a background of what the monkeypox case is. It seems like we're moving from one virus to another. The rise of the monkeypox infection with cases of the monkeypox virus expected to rise. WHO says that it spread outside of Africa is containable as more governments are set to launch limited vaccinations to combat its rise. Now, the move came as authorities investigated 237 suspected and confirmed cases in 19 countries, of which the majority have been reported in Europe. Scientists do not expect the outbreak will evolve into a pandemic like the COVID-19, reassuring that the virus does not spread as easily. So the question is Malaysia at risk of a monkeypox outbreak? Now, in a statement on Saturday, the Health DG, Tan Sri Dr. Noor Hisham Abdullah, said that the risk of monkeypox spreading to Malaysia is low unless there is a history of contact with infected animals or direct contact with infected patients. So we're just putting this out there to advise the public not to panic, not to create unnecessary panic by spreading false information. If you are unwell or experiencing any weird symptoms, please go to the nearest clinic and hospital. Any of our panelists would like to jump in and provide any comments, AT?
I think, like you said, Elaine, it's not cause for concern yet, but I think we have been proactive in making sure that even our MySejahtera app seems to be able to capture something along those lines. So I think government is very proactive and they are forthcoming with all the actions that they're doing. And I think it's no big deal now, but I think maybe if it becomes a big deal, I'm sure we're going to dedicate one full session for it. So
yes. So at least we are having sort of like a cautionary tale here.
Yes.
Pete, you have any comments with regards to this?
Yeah, I think that the key to it is not to panic over this. The number of cases that we're seeing outside of endemic countries is really quite small, and there doesn't seem to be a massive spread of this at the moment. So don't panic. If, as you say, if you do have symptoms of this, get to your doctor and get it checked. But I think we should be okay with this. This is not COVID.
Yeah, Bobby.
No, I think I go with both the gentlemen here. Nothing much. Just don't panic and be cautious. Do the right things. Read up a bit if you want to know more, and don't rumor monger. That's all.
Yeah, and then we'll be in the sort of like in a good place as long as we stay up to date, stay educated, and keep each other healthy and safe. I want to go to the next topic, but I know, AT, you wanted to highlight this as well. So perhaps I'll let you elaborate on it a little bit further, the AP abolition. So perhaps you want to elaborate a bit on what you wanted to highlight, AT.
I mean, I think that abolishment of AP came out again as a very surprise move, but it's a good surprise because when PM made an announcement saying, look, we're abolishing 4 items, and I think Mafi clarified which 4 items was it in the immediate next day. And then it was joined by a 5th item earlier this week, which is wheat. So I think government has been very proactive in trying to manage the short-term supply side issue, because there's a lot of issue on the supply side, and the government needs to manage the buffer within, ensure that we don't have regulatory impediments to bring in supplies from other sources besides those who are holding their APs. But my contention has always been this, I think we spoke about it even earlier this week, that you cannot have an open-ended AP abolishment forever, because at the medium and the long term, you're going to have our domestic players, our domestic agro-food industry suffer. And I think that's also in line with the subsidies. I think even Tengku Zafrul is in the World Economic Forum speaking about the subsidies, which is now closer to $70 billion. If you continue the subsidy that we give to even our agro-food farmers now, as we're doing now, 528 million for just chicken and egg, if we continue this indefinitely, we will end up where we are with petrol subsidies. 10 to 20 years' time, the basis of why we changed it, everybody would have forgotten the Ukraine war, and the subsidies will continue to exist. To me, this is a short-term measure. Let's use it as a tool, but let's make sure that we put a caveat that we will take it out when the market stabilizes with supply side. And our food deficit is very, very high. We will have to agree, but food deficit doesn't mean food self-sufficiency. I think that's again a misnomer. I think India has done it, wheat supply, and realized it's much harder or much more expensive to produce wheat in their country compared to importing wheat from the Russia and Ukraine market. So to me, tools should be adequate to the timelines, and that should not become a long-term burden. We end up with fuel subsidy. Until today, we don't have a targeted fuel subsidy system, and we're still grappling with it.
Any comments, Bobby?
No, I think that's got it right. The subsidies are never a long-term measure. If I just take the subsidy piece into account and not just the APs here, right? I mean, subsidized economies generally tend to get stuck in a certain trap, which we all know what it is. You never move forward because you're not enhancing your end-to-end delivery skills. So it has to be a phased role of subsidies, but you just cannot, put a chop to it. You will have to redirect that funds, redirect that support toward the higher end of the value chains of all those sectors, whether it be food, whether it is agriculture, natural resources, manufacturing. I don't think we've gotten that side, well understood, because we are already so entrenched in supply chains of many of the global players. We are very small cogs in very large wheels. Even if we take up larger pieces of those large wheels, I think we're in a much better place to utilize subsidies for where it is needed the most and not where it is perceived to be needed the most. I think that flip has to happen.
Pete.
Absolutely. As Dato was saying, the management of a nation's food security really emphasizes policy coherence. And it does fall within the decision and policymakers' responsibility for the areas that have that direct or indirect impact on food and nutrition. Trade, agriculture, health, environment, all of those departments or ministries. And they really have to make sure that we have and continue to have food security under the 4 pillars, which is the availability, the access, the utilization, and the stability of food. So, looking at best practices, using, evidence-based knowledge, coordination processes at all levels, so that we can deal with all 4 of those pillars, or whichever pillar it is that is coming under stress at the moment. And that is a short-term measure. It should be a short-term measure. However, in the long term, I think that one of the things that we really need to look at is that governments were going to need to totally review their current food security structures, because this is a global issue now, not just a Malaysian issue. And they need to look at those to be able to resolve. Yeah.
So, Pete, we're going into the topic that you wanted to highlight this week as well, correct? We're talking about global food security.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the global food security, I think we need to really define what it is and understand what it is in its essence. And it's defined as a situation that exists where all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food. And then there are the 4 pillars that I mentioned earlier. What impacts on food security at a global and a domestic level are things like issues of governance, that being inadequate governance structures to ensure stability and transparency, war, conflict and lack of security, political instability, weak institutions, inadequate state service and inadequate coherence in policy making. So there are others that impact economic and production issues, climate, environment, and unsustainable uses of natural resources. So what we see in the global perspective that is absolutely clear is that the disruption to production and supply chains caused by the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact of disruption to those in agricultural harvest brought on by the Ukraine war has provided sufficient stress in the global marketplace and within domestic policy for us to see not only shortages emerging, but also a cost of living crisis beginning to emerge. And my final sort of summary on that was that we're looking at is that we see a need for governments to actually totally review their current food security structures. That would be a very relevant thing to do, not only to resolve this crisis, the current crisis, but also to provide sustainability levels for citizens actually moving forward to make sure this doesn't happen again.
AP, you wanted to talk about this as well, IT?
Yeah, actually, that's the thing, right? So maybe a textbook example is a Qatar, right? So if you take what happened to them in about, say, 5-6 years ago, from a net importer of food, they have become a net exporter, at least in the GCC countries. They have become a net exporter of milk. And actually, a Malaysian company is actually behind that Belladonna, if I'm not mistaken, that's the name of that local company there. And I think the Malaysians, somehow we have figured out that we can get more milk per cow there than we can do it here. That belittles me. But again, I think that commitment comes back to what Bobby mentioned just now, right? So if you take I'll give you another example, right? If you take foreign workers policy, we collect 3 billion ringgit every year from the foreign workers levy. But that 3 billion doesn't get translated to that automation exercises that say these SMEs need to do. So unless you have that feedback loop, which is what he mentioned just now. So if you're going to have this feedback loop, only then you'll be able to automate, which means in the long term, you'll reduce the number of dependencies on foreign workers. Exact thing must go into the food security. So that's a closed loop. And if that subsidies are now being spent to increase our food sufficiencies, then that will have a long-term impact. On the other hand, what we work is we don't really work that way. We continue giving subsidies, but we work on the ability of food sufficiency on an entirely different page. That synchronization, I hope the policymakers in Putrajaya will make moving forward.
Bobby?
Yeah, I mean, we see that in the economic and production issues, as Dato absolutely says there. Insufficient access by producers to relevant technologies, input, and institutions. If there's insufficient focus on production, livestock production, and agricultural systems, you're going to end up with this food security issue.
Yeah, Bobby, any comments?
I mean, yeah, nothing much to add. I think the gentlemen have said it all. All I would suggest is that let's start looking at value chains, right? We don't invest enough time in thinking through the value chains. I guess we've gotten too comfortable with the consistent production abilities of fairly low skilled industries across the country. And I'm not picking any one industry in general. You got to raise the bar.
Bobby, what is your topic that you would like to highlight this week?
Yeah, I think a very, very pertinent time for talking about carbon, about the general commitments. I know that the finance minister had made last year about talking about carbon credits, bring a net zero country by 2050, reducing 45% by 2030, right? Our average carbon footprint. The actions that are commensurately required, I think no conversation is happening. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, it seems to have gotten stuck in a policy paralysis around what should we do in terms of a green tech incentive or some kind of allowances, right? I think there is a larger opportunity here, which it's high time now we get industry to participate, right? And there are three facets that I want to talk about very quickly. One is in terms of structuring a long tail of the carbon market. As talking carbon is just going to become a function of Petronas and a few plantation owners only then, to keep reducing their footprint and no one else. We cannot allow that to happen. It has to have everyone involved. What it means is down to the smallest shop lot factory as well, right? And at some point in that long tail, it also becomes you and I, individuals, who can actually create credits using our own little gardens. I mean, we're all having little gardens. And that's the level of a long tail, I think, structuring we have to do. Step number one. Step number two is how do you enable it, therefore? The enablement comes from, by virtue of three mechanisms that have really proven pretty beneficial in the European Union context. You can see it's carbon taxation, but it doesn't stop there. There is, exchange trading services for actual carbon. I know the minister did talk about a voluntary carbon market. I would encourage the SC to start, creating a carbon window completely, right alongside stocks and bonds. Why not carbon? And the third piece is around, of course, cross-border transactions, carbon offset, so that you don't want manufacturers running away from a tighter regulated country to a, less regulated country just to offset on taxes. All of these have to go hand in glove. And then the third element is individual accountability, right? Is what can you and I do in terms of our current footprint? I mean, Europeans are really smart. Everybody knows their carbon footprint. There are a range of technologies out there to assist us. There are a range of organizations. There are a range of consultants. I think we need to be able to build that ecosystem. We have to. I don't think we have a choice. Whether it is academic institutions, whether it is private organizations, to build those capabilities so we are then able to disseminate that competency so that you and I can calculate our footprint and say, A, how do I offset it? And B, what can I do with that offset, right? I could either trade just to make some money out of it, or I could reinvest it elsewhere. Now, all of these, when you put together, the number you said, Dato, 3 billion from just the foreign workers, imagine the volumes here. You're talking 50, 60, 100 billion of money available for us to do the right things in the first point I was making, which is about the value chain. So I think what I would encourage is more conversations around carbon, the whole ecosystem. We need to encourage a lot more of these to make it more of a public conversation.
Oh, I love, this whole line of conversation. Pete, you want to elaborate a little bit on this?
There's absolutely nothing that I can elaborate on that Bobby hasn't covered. He's nailed it. The key to it, though, really, I think, is that, as Bobby says, it's that we are all stakeholders in this. We all have a responsibility for this, and that needs to be shared. There needs to be a mechanism, as Bobby says, for us to be able to understand it, develop it, and actively partake in that.
I think Bobby mentioned it earlier. I think it shouldn't be just Petronas, because Petronas alone has said, look, we'll plant 100 million trees soon to offset what we are doing in the country, in the nation. But it also should start with a small mom and pop shop, and for that you need to get these SMEs to start their ESG journey. So if for an SME to start the ESG journey, I think that's where the government must step in. The Petronases of the nation must step in to start guiding both their vendors in their supply chain and also the small, medium enterprises. The government can step in to start the ESG journey. It can be as simple as the individual or the institution or the company, but that journey must start now. And that tools, that freebies, and I don't know whether incentives can be worked onto it, even in terms of green tech or even in terms of financing. Maybe if somebody has got a good carbon footprint, then maybe he should get an incentive. He should be given a handicap to both financing or to incentives or even government procurement. I think those are the things that will work very, very well, because the carrot and stick approach, I think this time around, I think the carrot should work first. Simply because this is voluntary carbon market, right? I think government has said by end of this year, they'll get that digital emission trading scheme, which Bursa and SC is working together with MOF to put it up. I hope that we achieve what we want to do, get the institutional footprints right now.
No, I think it's perfect, Bobby. I really love that you brought this up, because I think at the end of the day, it's we need a little bit more communication in order to create that understanding, because I think a lot of people sort of shy away from the entire ESG, carbon credit, because it seems too.
They just don't understand it.
Too much, that's like you said, that's Petronas's and whoever that's the big voice. Yeah, not ours. But it's like how you said, it can be as simple as, creating that carbon trading, allowing people, it's like crypto. What you don't understand it, you stay away from it. And then if you understand crypto, you will want to be part of it, or you can understand how to sort of navigate it. Similarly with carbon, I think with a little bit more education and communication and understanding, all of us can be part of that sort of carbon trading. When you're talking about it, I'm saying that, I think we have that capability to be able to be part of that global carbon solution, because we are able to trade those credits if we are able to get those credits and know how to create those credits on our individual basis, beyond just the giants, beyond just the corporates. Even on individual levels, we can actually contribute towards this outcome. So fantastic. And any more comments for Bobby?
One point, I think, just to illustrate that there are very few, but there are some thinkers, and I'm giving the Malaysian context, obviously, and I will not mention corporate names, but there is one gentleman who's actually focusing on creating urban farms, and his goal is your garden, right? He's got a farm, right? Potentially, you could grow tomatoes or whatever, but there is a carbon offset for that, for every square foot of property that you're sitting on, right? Or if you're just growing grass, right? Just keep growing the grass, and I'll give you a credit. I will establish your footprint, net it off your current consumption model, and then allow it to be traded on an exchange. So that is happening actually by a Malaysian gentleman. I'm really loving it, what he's doing. And there is another gentleman who's actually said, you know what, the point you just made, Elaine, I'm going to create a private, carbon trading marketplace. So he's going to start a digital asset exchange with carbon as one of the 3 components of trading assets. And so you know what, I'll give you the consulting help to go and figure out how to build your footprint, how to certify it, and then I'll allow you to go and trade it. And it's all going to happen here, right? And hopefully in the next 2-3 months, we'll start seeing private sector getting, more involved. But now I know only 2 or 3 people who are talking about this. And luckily, these 2 guys are very good friends of mine, and we headbang a lot. But now we need a lot more dissemination to happen.
We're looking forward to that. I think everybody can sort of create that impact. Now, we have just time for maybe one more topic. I wanted to have AT, perhaps you can tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, I mean, actually, what's on everybody's mind? Who's the next Deputy Prime Minister, right? So I hope that we have this conversation next Friday, or whoever's on the panel will probably discuss the cabinet reshuffle that's supposedly happening. But all the action happens to be happening outside of Malaysian borders. One is started in Turkey. I think the shock is being felt somewhere in Japan, and Malaysians are actually waiting for something to happen next week. And it's good that the law minister has actually given some details. He's come out yesterday evening and said, look, there are some things in the anti-hopping bill, and that will be purely people who actually hop or switch parties and move on from or resign from their parties and move on to another bandwagon. And then the speaker's got 20 days to call for an election to determine whether that is a hopping, and from there in 60 days to call for an election. So that's like 3 months from the time you hop. But it doesn't apply or doesn't prevent another Sheraton move. That's also said that en bloc movements are not part of this anti-hopping law. I think that's a little bit of granular details. It also involves independent moving. I think everybody is pushing for it because you already can see a lot of mobility within the parliamentary seats. I suppose everyone is hoping that there'll be stabilization until elections are called. I think there's a huge number of us who are hoping that elections will be later rather than sooner. And those, I'm sure there are those who are hoping elections will be held next week.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is pre-hopping of the anti-hopping bill coming in, which is quite interesting.
Pre-hop, anti-hop.
Pre-hop and post-hop, yeah. The key to it really, from an external perspective on Malaysian politics is that one of the keys to foreign direct investment is political stability. You have to have political stability in the country for that to increase, for investors to feel confident coming in. And this will actually add a level of confidence to a prospective FDI coming into the country. So from an external viewpoint, it's a very positive move.
Bobby.
Yeah, I won't comment on the bills and all, but I take a shot at the larger picture of how do we define democracy. We seem to have lost the plot of democracy seems to have become a slave to parties, and ideologies are parties, right? At some point, the constitution gets subjugated, or it has been maligned or misinterpreted or interpreted in a way that is very convenient at the appropriate moment in time. So the fundamental principles of equity, equality, the rule of law are often justified as unnecessary or onerous given a current scenario. I keep worrying, and it is not a Malaysian issue, it is a global issue with all democracies.
Yeah.
There is a fundamental fallacy in the model that slavery to a party, right, takes away the relevance of a constitution. How do we bring it back? It's a big, much larger question, right? Can we flip it back to say the constitution overrides everything else, and parties and ideologies can change, they should change, they must change, but let them not sabotage the entire system of governance that takes so hard to build but can collapse in a day, right?
Thank you, Bobby, for saying that. I just want to quickly talk about this, talking about elections, at the end of the day, it boils back down to essentially living. I want to quickly touch about the food price inflation. I don't talk about food security, but of course, in a recent news publication from Bernama, MIDF research states that Malaysia's food inflation will remain on the upward path. And because we're, of course, a net food importing country, we're highly exposed to these global shocks. And the government is doing its best to deal with, these factors. But as cliche as it sounds, this is unprecedented. We're reeling in the afterstorm of sorts of now supply chain problems. There's a lot of things. This is confusing a lot of people. Perhaps you can just a quick comment from all three of you before we close. Let's start with you, Bobby.
See, I think this is a temporary problem. I don't see it as stretching too far out into the future. What it is allowing us is, after the Second World War, right, and the two economic crises, the big ones. One was very Asian, one was global. We did build fairly resilient structures, whether it is governance, whether it's law, whether it is collaboration platforms. There are a whole range of free trade agreements out there, all of these multilateral, bilaterals, that do bring in a sufficient amount of guarantees, right? Assuming that the players do not walk away. But these are strong, and you cannot just refute them away. So I see this as a temporary, problem. The inflation is only one aspect of it. There are many other aspects. Now you're going to talk about wealth distribution. Now, what is that? What are we talking about there? That is the wealth being equitably distributed. Do we have enough wealth lying in to spend more on imports, right? For example, or as our currency is tanking. So all of these do come into play. So I don't see it as a long-term problem. What I do see as a big opportunity to make some resets.
Thank you, Bobby. I've run out of time. Perhaps just a word from AT and a word from Pete.
If you're talking about food inflation, I think it's a lot of it is imported inflation, primarily because our currency, as Bobby said, it's tanking. So that once that subside, we'll probably have some stability. But food prices, once they go up, they have never come down.
Never comes down. Pete?
Never comes down.
Yeah, UK is at 9%, worst inflation in 40 years, likely to go to 10%, says Bank of England. It's a global thing. This has been brought on by COVID. There's no doubt about this at all. This has been brought on by the issues of supply chains. The war in Ukraine has also impacted. So it is probably a short term. Short term, we're talking probably 9 to 12 months.
Okay. Thank you so much, Pete. Thanks, Bobby. Thanks, Pete. Thanks, AT, for this fabulous conversation that we're having on this Friday. Have a good Friday, everyone. We will, of course, speak to Dr. AT KUMARARAJAH, Treasurer General NCCIM, Board of VARANASI, Tech and Business Analyst, as well as Peter NICOLL, Managing Partner of Counter Risk Consultancy Malaysia, Sdn Bhd. Thanks for staying with me till the end of this session of The Nation this week. I'm Elaine Blah. Bye for now.